Inner Chaos by Grevin Hades. Chapter 17 Surprises and Plans. Cadence slowly trotted past Grevin, watching him gather his items from the guard ponies while making her way towards Applejack and Fluttershy, who stood off in a small alcove, waiting patiently while the rest of the group made their way out of the castle and to the markets, before heading to the train station to return to Ponyville. A small smirk coming across her lips as she heard the quick gallop of Twilight moving up behind her. She slowed her walk until her sister-in-law had passed by her and joined her friends, rolling her eyes slightly at how nervous yet excited they seemed to be. She moved herself in front of them and lightly cleared her throat. "All right, girls. Are you ready for me to give you some advice?" The three nodded, each looking at her with wide, eager eyes and nervous smiles. It was actually pretty cute. Cadence held back her chuckle and simply smiled as she glanced over her shoulder, making sure Grevin was still trying to get his equipment back. She had given the guards orders to stall him until she had finished speaking with the girls. Sure enough, he was indeed waiting while the guard took his time, listing off everything that had to be turned in to verify that it indeed belonged to Grevin. She turned back and smiled at the three before her and sat down on her haunches. "Very well. You've told me that he used to have a love back on his home that betrayed him and was just using him for his abilities. I believe that the trauma of that, combined with his loveless environment growing up, has caused him to believe that something as wonderful as love is something that he isn't capable of having. Or at the very least, I think he doesn't see it as an option for himself, even if he wants it." All three mares frowned upon hearing these words, but as Twilight and Applejack lowered their gaze to the floor, Fluttershy took a hesitant step forward. If I may ask, is that why he blushes so much when we try to get close to him?" This caused the other two to perk up and glance at their timid friend, before looking back at Cadence, who now had a bright smile on her lips, a soft giggle escaping her. "Honestly, I don't think so. Well, not all of it. While he is brave in a fight and shows tremendous strength and has a wonderful sense of character, I think that deep down, it's all a front. I think he is shy, especially around females." The three ponies all paused before glancing over at the man they felt for, looks of surprise washing over their features before turning back to the Princess of Love. Applejack quirked an eyebrow, tilting her head to the side. Princess, you're not serious, are you?" Cadence smiled and nodded. "I am. I think you have to really think about his behavior. You might come to the same conclusion I have." Twilight sat down, raising her hoof to her chin, a look of concentration coming across her face. "Well, let's see. Whenever I got close to him, he would always blush and avert his eyes. Not to mention, he would tense up whenever there was physical contact." Fluttershy nodded in agreement. "Don't forget how he wouldn't let us see his face for the longest time. He said it was just because he didn't want to frighten anybody, even when he was seriously injured after helping me. But I think there was more to it. Maybe it was his way of avoiding getting close to anyone back in his home, and he just continued it here." Applejack sighed as she finally realized that it all made sense. Huh. Even at Sweet Apple Acres, he wouldn't let us see his face until that night we had that little cookout. Even when I tried to get him to loosen up in the pond with some splashing, he seemed very tense and blushed an awful lot. Cadence grinned and took a moment to look at each mare in the eyes before continuing. "Well, the question now is, how do you get him to open up and realize that you can be more than friends?" Fluttershy quietly raised the shaky hoof. Princess, don't you have a spell that could easily remedy that?" Cadence frowned and quickly shook her head, causing the timid mare to shrink back with a small squeak. "No way! That spell is meant to help those already in love. Remember why they love their significant other in the first place. If I were to try and use that spell on you three and Grevin, chances are it could blow things far out of proportion, or even backfire." Applejack frowned. "Well, that option's no good." She sighed a bit as she lowered her gaze. There has to be something we can do. Cadence simply smiled and nodded. There is. You should be a bit more assertive when trying to get him to take notice. He needs to learn that he can see you as more than a friend. Twilight frowned. But I already tried that, and it didn't work. If anything, it drove him away. Cadence closed her eyes. Twilight, I believe you may not fully understand what I mean. You shouldn't back down right away. If you and your friends would be willing, I could give you a small demonstration as to what I'm referring to, but I won't do it unless you three are all right with it. Twilight bit her bottom lip and glanced over at her two friends. Applejack had a small frown on her lips. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she gave a curt nod, while Fluttershy quickly shook her pink mane flowing in front of her eyes momentarily. Yes, please. After that assertiveness training I had before, I took things too far. I don't want to make that mistake again. Twilight turned back to her sister-in-law and nodded. All right, Cadence. She nodded and rose to her hooves. Very well. I'm going to speak to Grevin in another room. Please cast an observation spell on me, and no matter what happens, you must not leave this spot until I have finished. Understood? She waited for the three to agree to her terms before slowly turning to walk away, only pausing to look back over her shoulder for a moment. And Twilight? Yes? She tilted her head to the side, her mane draping lightly across her forehead and horn. Cadence sighed. Please don't read too much into this. Twilight blinked a moment and then nodded, a small smile coming to her lips. Don't worry, Cadence. I know you love my brother more than anything. Cadence smiled and nodded as she made her way over to Grevin. As she did, Twilight turned to face Applejack and Fluttershy, her horn glowing slightly, causing a small window to appear on the wall behind them, showing Cadence approaching Grevin, with a simple smile on her face. Perspective change. Grevin had been waiting patiently as the White Pegasus guard in golden armor double-checked the list of his belongings. He could feel his frustration growing as he crossed his arms and closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. Mr. Hades? His breathing paused a moment as he opened his eyes and looked over his shoulder to see Princess Cadence making her way over towards him, her usual smile on her face, though something else seemed to be in her eyes. Yes, Princess? She stopped just a few steps from him and smiled softly, her eyes glancing to the guard, giving his belongings, and then to him. I was hoping I could speak to you for a few moments. She glanced at the guard again. Privately. I can assure you that once we are finished, Sergeant Irons here will return your belongings without question. Right, Sergeant? The guard saluted and stood at attention. Yes, ma'am. Grevin quietly nodded, letting his arms fall to his sides as he moved to walk beside the Crystal Princess. She moved at a light trot, leading him from the main hallway, down a side hall, and after a few turns, into a large sitting room that, despite its large windows, seemed to be somewhat dim lit. The room itself was fairly large, clearly designed to hold ponies for a medium-sized dinner party. The ceiling rose several feet into the air, and had ornate designs all over it, all of it very intricate, flowing from one section into the next, all of it leading up to a large crystal chandelier that hung in the center of the room. The floor had a soft, very beautiful carpet laid out across it that led to a small set of tiles that surrounded a large fireplace. There were several couches, all of which appeared to be covered with leather, and covered with plush pillows, as well as at least 5 different chairs, all spread out through the room. The windows themselves had large red drapes that were pulled to the side, revealing a beautiful view of the land below, showing the mountains, Canterlot City, and the plains and rivers in the distance. Grevin paused at the doorway, taking the room in slowly before making his way inside and moving to the window to look out and see the view it offered. He heard the clop of Cadence's hooves step off the stone floor of the hallway and move onto the soft carpeting, muffling her every step. All right, princess. What did you need to speak to me about? He kept his back turned as he listened to her take a small breath. I wanted to thank you personally for saving Shining, the school foals, and myself from that dragon attack. If you hadn't arrived when you did, we all would likely have been killed. You're a hero. He shook his head, lowering his gaze, his shoulders slumping a bit. If I had been faster, no loss of life would have occurred. And if I had never come to Canterlot, this whole mess would have been avoided. I'm glad I was able to help as much as I did, but I don't agree with being called a hero. Cadence sighed as she took a step closer. Grevin, I saw you do something that hardly any pony had ever done before. I saw you rush in with no concern for yourself and fight to save the lives against a dragon. I saw you take a beating being thrown into a building and rise up, ready to fight more. And then I saw something truly amazing. As you were trying to heal that mare, I saw a powerful, strange magic coming from you. Not around you, but inside you, shining like a bright light. With every second that passed, that light grew brighter and brighter. It was almost frightening and beautiful. Trevin frowned once more, but took a slow breath, then pushed down his stubborn nature, and instead gave a small nod. I tried to help where I could, nothing more, but if you say that makes me a hero, then thank you for your kind words. He heard Cadence giggle a bit before the sound of magic being surged through her reached his ears, followed by the sound of the room doors slamming shut, followed by the very audible click of their locks. He began to rise up to stand straight and turn around when he felt something that caused him to visibly tense up, stopping him cold. He felt a soft hoof slowly slide over his back to his hip, while a warm breath washed over his right shoulder, ear, and part of his neck, followed by a sultry, soft voice sounding in his ear. Then don't you think you should receive a hero's reward? He felt his cheeks begin to redden as he quickly turned to the left, stepping back, noticing that Cadence had somehow moved to within inches of him, her light purple eyes staring into his as she tried to move closer. Her lips parted slightly as a small hint of blush rose to her cheeks. He quickly stepped back, putting some distance between her and him, moving to his right, along the far wall of the room. Princess, what is the meaning of this? Cadence smirked and slowly moved after him, her wings extending outward, allowing her to make it easier for her to block him from getting around, as she moved closer. I'm simply trying to give you a reward for your actions, Grevin. I have every right to do so, as a princess of Equestria. He shook his head once more as he continued to step back. His cheeks continued to hold their blush as he tried to keep himself calm. Princess, I don't need any sort of reward. Being made a spectral knight is plenty reward for me. Cadence smirked and sent him another sultry pout as she moved closer, trying to back him into a corner. Nonsense. This is something I wish to do on my own. You don't see Aunt Celestia or Luna in here with us, do you? Now allow me to give you a well-deserved kiss. Griffin blinked and quickly turned once more, using a chair to block her path as he moved around her, so he could back up to the door. He lightly shook his hands in front of him as he tried to remain polite. No, that's all right. Besides, you're a married pony. I doubt Shining Armor would like the idea of his wife kissing someone, let alone an outsider like me. I do not wish to upset the captain of the guard. Cadence paused, her eyes softening as she turned to face him fully, and for a moment Grevin thought he had gotten through to her, until he watched her lips curl up into another sultry smile. She continued to move steadily towards him, moving around another chair as her voice became huskier. Now, don't worry about Shining. He knows I'm the Princess of Love, and he accepts that I'm going to do many things that normally would make a marriage difficult. It's one of the many reasons I love him so much. He accepts me for who I am. She lowered her head like a predator watching him with determined eyes. And honestly, Sir Hades, if I hadn't ever met Shining, I could easily find myself falling for one such as yourself. It's quite clear that many a mare will take interest in you once news of the dragon attack spreads from Canterlot. You may even find a companion, or even a herd to call your own. This caused Grevin to freeze for a moment, confusion washing over his features for a few seconds. This all sounded awfully familiar to what Luna had spoken to him about the night before. Was Cadence really trying to get him to open his heart? What was it with these ponies in matters of heart and love? And what the hell was a herd? He wasn't given much time to think on that before his vision was filled with Cadence leaning into him once more. Her lips parted ever so slightly, her eyes fluttering shut as she leaned in for the kiss. Now hold still. Grevin growled a bit, his frustration growing, and quickly pulled it back, jerking himself to the side once more, putting more distance between himself and the pink princess, who was beginning to look frustrated with her prey. I don't think I want to be kissed, princess. I mean no disrespect, but I am not comfortable with it. Can't a simple thank you be enough? Cadence blew a few strands of her yellow, pink, and purple mane from her face, and looked at him with narrowed eyes for a few moments, before once again giggling and breaking into a bright smile. Well, why didn't you say you weren't comfortable with a kiss? Grevin paused a moment before visibly relaxing, a look of confusion washing over him at the sudden change in her demeanor. She finally understood his position and was going to stop coming after him. He closed his eyes in relief, glad to be out of that situation, only to feel the familiar tingle of magic being used once again. He had no chance to react as one of the large couches surged forward, slamming into his legs from behind, knocking him backwards onto the soft cushions. He barely had time to get his bearings before he felt a few large, light gusts of air wash over him, followed by the soft weight on his shoulders. Looking straight up above him, he saw Cadence looking down at him with a seductive gaze, her mane flowing down around her face in a fine cascade, causing him to blush once more and avert his gaze. Cadence leaned down and slowly nuzzled her cheek against his, and lightly nibbled on his ear, before speaking with a soft, sultry voice. If a kiss will not do, then I know of other ways to thank a hero. Though I didn't think you'd want to take things on that kind of route. But I don't mind. Quite adventurous of you, actually. And so, out in the open. Grevin froze, his face paling, while his eyes grew wide as he felt himself begin to react to her words. And close proximity. His pants beginning to grow tighter. He quickly moved a hand down to his pants in an attempt to cover his shame, only to have a magical aura surround his limbs and force them to the side, holding him there against his will. Princess, this isn't right. Cadence slowly lowered herself down and began to brush her lips over his neck, kissing it lightly while she slid a hoof down along his chest and then to his side. She could feel his heart be pulsing, and while it was beating far faster than normal, it was clear to her that deep in the back of his mind, part of him was enjoying it. Grevin, why do you hesitate to accept this? Are you afraid you'll enjoy it? Do you think you can't be loved by a pony? Grevin frowned and jerked his head back, pulling his neck away from her teasing lips, a small growl escaping him. No, I don't. Not by a pony, not by anyone. I've been lied to, I've been cheated, and I've been looked at with disdain. The one woman I gave my heart to drove a dagger in it. Why, after all that, would you think I'm capable of love? The better question is, why would I want to try and love again? This made Cadence pause for a moment, her eyes softening with sadness at his words. She could feel the pain in his voice, and it made her eyes water at how he had been treated in the past. However, rather than become discouraged, she became more determined. She couldn't help but smile, knowing that if he were to give them a chance, the three mares outside, and perhaps the others, would help him overcome his past, his hurt, and his self-doubt. Much to his frustration, Cadence simply paused in her actions, only to move in closer under his chin in order to nibble at his collar, a soft moan escaping her throat. Griffin tried to pull his head back, but her magic forced him to stay still and take her teasing. Cadence, Princess, stop. His voice was softer this time, more subdued. She smirked and moved to his ear, once more nibbling as she went, her soft hoof sliding down further, brushing over his hip, causing him to shift under her. I don't think so. Not until you know what I've come to realize about you. He grunted as he tried once again to free himself from her magic. But her magic held strong, keeping him in place while she moved over him. Subtly and with deliberate motions, her soft coat teasing his skin, her hot breath washing over him. Despite his strength, he was still susceptible to her strong magic. It was similar to the magic in Bastion. While he could fight physically and hold his own, the correct kind of spell could easily take him down and make him feel useless. He grit his teeth, trying to resist the sensations she caused him to feel. Fine. What is it that you know? She smiled softly and pulled back so she could look down at him with soft, sincere eyes, and raised a hoof to his chest, tapping it gently against him. You try to convince yourself that love is not meant for you, that you should be alone, all because of a terrible past. I can see something deep inside you that few others can. There is love inside you. Great love, shining like a beacon in the dark. You care for everyone you know. You're willing to die to help those who cannot help themselves, including strangers you have never met before. You care. You empathize. That is the very essence of love. You are capable of not only giving love, but you secretly want it as well. She slowly lowered her head, her gaze never wavering from his, as she moved closer and closer, raising her hooves to his neck, sliding them down around him. And the only one holding you back from that. She closed her eyes and tilted her head, parting her lips slightly. Is you. She pressed her lips into his. A deep, slow kiss that caused him to tense and jerk back in an attempt to break free. However, she did not relent and pushed him down into the cushioned couch, and after a few moments, his attempts to fight it began to slow. He felt her gently push her tongue against his lips, asking for entrance, and slowly, he allowed her to have her way, his eyes closing as she did. Cadence mentally cheered in victory as she slid her tongue into his mouth, allowing the muscle to lightly dance with his, a soft moan escaping her throat. It was clear to her that Grevin had been kissed before, but he clearly had never experienced a kiss like this. Not by someone who cared, and had some real experience as well. His motions were hesitant at best, but she soon coaxed him into being a little braver. She leaned in and pressed against him, deepening the kiss, letting her lower half rub against him, as she dropped the force field holding his hands in place under her. She half expected him to try and escape once more, and she did feel him move under her, tensing his legs as if he was preparing to toss her aside and make a run for it. But as quickly as that started, it stopped, and he slowly raised a hand to her mane and ran his fingers through it, earning another soft moan from her. Slowly, she began to pull back, breaking the kiss, leaving a small trail of saliva between her lips. She quickly darted out her tongue, snatching it into her mouth with a soft sigh, before letting her gaze move across his face. He was blushing crimson now. His breathing was slow, but not stable. His eyes were wide, and it was clear he was shocked. She giggled and lightly ran her hoof over his cheek. I didn't break you, did I? I'm pretty sure that your friend would be rather upset with me if I did. Grevin blinked a moment, trying to gather his thoughts about him, confusion showing in his eyes. But I don't. A soft hoof on his lips forced him to stop and look up at the pony resting atop him, her eyes soft and smiling, promising that everything was all right. Grevin, I know that you feel that love can never find you, but I wanted to make sure that you knew that you can and will one day find love. Perhaps with a pony, perhaps even a herd, perhaps a lady dragon, or even a griffin. The possibilities are endless, and it all comes down to you being willing to give love an opportunity to find you. Do you understand what I'm saying? He slowly pushed himself out from underneath her, forcing her to sit back a bit on his legs, while he did his best to sit up. His eyes were downcast, in thought, and his face emotionless, as he said nothing for several seconds. Giddens frowned a bit and slowly reached out a hoof to his cheek, only to have his hand come up and catch it in a firm but gentle grip, keeping her from getting any closer. Revan? She prayed he wasn't going to put up a shell around him once again. He sighed a bit, his shoulders shifting slightly as he raised his head, bringing his eyes to meet hers, causing her to pause her breathing. His stare was empty, unreadable. Princess, I understand what you are trying to do, but you have to understand that I have a very hard time accepting what you're saying. I've always been looked down on, hated even, and now for that to suddenly change, and for me to be accepted, held, even a possible love interest, it's a lot to take in. I don't know if I can even handle it, to be honest. Kitten smiled and leaned forward, wrapping her forelegs around him, holding him close in a warm embrace. She rested her forehead against his, taking care to avoid hitting him with her horn. Her eyes locked onto his, causing him to freeze mid-sentence. You stallions are all the same. Just big goofballs at heart. I have no doubt that you can handle it. She tilted her head forward a bit, catching him in a light but warm kiss, pulling back a bit slower. All I ask is that you please consider what I've said, Grevin. I wasn't making things up when I told you you could easily win the heart of many a mare here in Equestria. His reaction was immediate. She pulled back, letting her hooves drop from his shoulders. As he looked away, clearly stunned, she giggled as she moved off the couch and stood next to him, smiling at the bright blush on his cheeks. She smirked, deciding to tease him a bit, and leaned in once more. Grevin, tell me you'll consider what I've told you. If you don't, I could always try convincing you by showing you what your hands could do to help a pony feel, well, amazing, really. His reaction was immediate. He quickly rose to his feet and moved back, shaking his head. No, that's all right. No need for that. Honestly, he felt terrible about kissing the princess, especially since he had just become friends with Shining Armor. Cadence, however, simply took a few steps towards him, with raised eyebrows and a slightly tilted head, silently urging him to finish his sentence. He gave a slow nod, giving in to her wishes, and sighed. I'll consider it. What you have told me, perhaps in time I can comfortably open my heart once more, and maybe even find some pony to love. Time will tell. As soon as the words left his lips, Cadence's horn lit up, and the doors to the room flew open, providing him with a route of escape. She simply smiled and nodded. Thank you, Grevin, and I promise this won't happen again. Well, unless you happen to save Shining in my life again. Then it won't well be a simple kiss on the cheek. He gave a small smile of thanks and a curt nod, before slowly turning to the exit. That would be more acceptable. Thank you. She laughed as he made his way out of the room, leaving her there for a moment to gather her thoughts. She knew that if she were to return to the main hall now, she would see 3 blushing mares running after an equally blushing man, all making their way to the train station to return to Ponyville. She hoped that he would at least consider her words and let himself see Twilight and her friends as they view him. They could easily be happy together, either as a single couple or even as a herd. A small smirk came across her lips as another thought came to mind. Those girls were going to give him a hell of a time now, and the competition would surely grow because of what happened in Canterlot. He was a hero now, and heroes always get adoring fans. Even she in shining armor had several notes mailed to them after the changeling invasion was thwarted. As she began walking down the main hall, she noticed that her Aunt Celestia had joined her, walking quietly beside her. She turned her head, noting the simple smile on her aunt's face. Celestia turned to her niece and laughed softly. I'm guessing you had a small discussion with Grevin about his possible love life here in Equestria. Am I right? Kitten smiled and nodded as she continued to walk. I did, and it took a little bit of convincing to get him to understand that he could make a mare very happy someday. Celestia giggled softly and shook her head. He came back to the main hall with mussed hair and wrinkled clothing, and a deep blush upon his cheeks. He put his cloak and hood on as soon as he could, and to hide his face, and to top things off, Twilight and her friends Applejack and Fluttershy quickly ran after him. As he left, their own faces a bit red. Just what did you do, Cadence? Cadence laughed and looked to the side. I may have had to convince him in a more unconventional manner than usual. Celestia smirked and returned her gaze forward, stopping at the castle entrance, her niece standing beside her, and in the distance, Grevin could be seen running towards the train station, his cloak billowing behind him, its swords and armor in their rightful places. But just behind him were the 3 mares, all watching him intently, doing their best to keep pace. You know what, Cadence? Cadence looked at her aunt curiously. Hmm? Celestia's smirk grew to a small grin. Back when I was your age, I would have done more than pin him down and kiss him a couple of times. To be honest, I probably would have done more even at my current age. After all, I do enjoy a good workout from time to time. Cadence blinked a few moments before stepping back, a look of surprise in her eyes, followed quickly by a blush on her cheeks, as the implications raced through her mind. Oh, I see. Oh my. Celestia laughed, seeing her blush, and lightly nudged her niece with her wing. Gotcha. Scene change. Ponyville train. Grevin sat silently in the main compartment, his hood up, hiding his still red cheeks from view. He settled himself in a window seat and sat turned, facing so he could watch the countryside pass by while he tried to gather his rushing thoughts. He barely paid any attention to the excited conversations of the girls echoing around him. A small frown formed on his lips as Cadence's words echoed through his mind, and the vivid encounter with her replaying over and over again in his memory. He could still feel the unexpected softness of her lips pressing to his, her smooth coat brushing over his skin, her tongue teasing his, even the faint hint of strawberries on her breath. All of it shook him to his very core, making him nervous and angry all at the same time. He clenched the fist as he closed his eyes and took a slow breath, trying to calm his nerves. He couldn't help but begin to wonder if Cadence was right about it. Maybe, just maybe, deep down in his heart, he really did want to give love another chance. But it was ridiculous to even think that. Even if a female were interested in him, it was for his power, not his heart. Power always attracts people, even if they don't realize it. The prospect of being with someone who had abilities he has could easily cloud the vision of a woman or a mare. He had seen it happen in Bastion, back when he would brawl in the bars. There would always be a barmaid trying to hang on his arm and get him to fall for her so she could show off her newest catch. But they never tried to get to know him. Even a few flinched when they got a good look at his face. He glanced over his shoulder at the 6 ponies talking amongst themselves, and his train of thought passed. They never flinched at his looks, nor did they seem to care about his abilities. From the moment he healed Fluttershy, they all accepted him without hesitation. Of course they had questions. Who wouldn't? But they accepted his answers and continued to try to get him to come out of his shell. They even threw him a party, introducing him to the majority of Ponyville, who, with their help, had welcomed him warmly. It was so foreign to him. He hardly knew how to respond to it at all. It was a total opposite of what he had become so accustomed to, and it was hard to adapt to, but it was still pleasant. He began to turn his head to the window, letting his gaze return to the countryside, as his mind slowly began to consider the possibility of pursuing matters of the heart once again. Would it be too bad to try and open his heart once more? Maybe date, or even possibly find love. There's always a risk of being hurt again, but at the same time, every time he expected something bad to happen, more often than not, the exact opposite occurred. Grevin! He turned, his thoughts torn to shreds by the sharp voice sounding in his ear, and he turned his head to find a pair of bright blue eyes trying to peek under his hood, causing him to jerk backwards, making his head hit the glass window with a solid thunk.
God, Pinky, don't do that.
The pink mare giggled, sitting back, tilting her head to the side. Okie dokie Loki, so are you ready for Nightmare Night? He blinked a moment, noting that all the girls had turned to face him, and slowly shook his head from side to side.
Honestly, I don't know what that is.
Pinkie Pie gasped, her eyes growing wide. You don't know? He again shook his head as Twilight moved forward, placing herself between Pinkie and him, a small smile on her lips. Pinkie, he isn't from Equestria. Chances are he doesn't even know any of our traditions yet. She looked over her shoulder and nodded at Grevin. So, would you like to hear about this holiday? He reached up and quietly pulled his hood back, confident that he had finally had control over his cheeks, and nodded.
I am a bit curious. For such a dark name, you certainly do sound quite happy about it.
Rarity grinned and nodded, as Twilight, as well as the rest of the main 6, all formed a small circle in the cabin. Twilight sitting almost uncomfortably close to his right, while Applejack took his left, and Fluttershy sat directly in front of him, with the rest filling in the empty spaces. Oh, darling, it's simply a wonderful event that is filled with fun games, silly scares, and even some mystery. He blinked a moment before tilting his head to the side.
Well, it sounds like quite the party, but why would it have mystery?
Rainbow Dash rose into the air with a laugh. Because of the costumes, duh. A couple of years ago, I dressed up as a Shadow Bolt and used a small thundercloud to scare every pony. It was totally awesome. Applejack cleared her throat, drawing the group's attention to her. She smiled and tilted her hat back a bit as she looked up at Grevin, a bright smile on her face. What they mean, Sugar Cube, is that we all dress up in costume for the night. It's tradition. It all goes back to when Princess Luna had been taken over by the power of Nightmare Moon. All the ponies would dress up in disguise to hide from the Nightmare, and leave her morsels of food so she would eat that rather than some poor pony that she happened to find. Twilight grinned and flared her horn to life, causing a small image of the fake Nightmare Moon / Princess Luna from the previous year to appear in front of the middle of the group. Grevin watched as it snapped its jaws, causing several foals to run from it in fear, before changing back into Luna, and burst into laughter. Currently, the tradition has changed into a lighter atmosphere. Ponies still dress up, but we play games, party, and the foals gather little candy treats to offer up to Nightmare Moon as tribute. But they get to keep most of the candy anyways. Pinkie Pie giggled and bounced on her tail a moment. Ooh, 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 and this year will be a best one yet. After 10 o'clock, all the foals will have gone home to be all snuggly-wuggly in their beds. And the adult ponies will get to have a big party. There will be more adult games, cider, even a few Nightmare Night-themed drinks. It's going to rock! Griffin paused a moment as he listened to the pink pony before slowly nodding, still trying to completely grasp everything that they had told him thus far.
I see. It sounds like a lively evening of fun. We never had anything like this back in Bastion. We had some celebrations, but those were mostly for royal events, such as weddings and the like. It sounds pretty interesting. What do ponies dress up as for this?
Fluttershy shivered as she ruffled her wings. Ponies dress up as all kinds of things. Some like to dress up in fun, silly outfits. Others like, scary ones. I don't like those very much, but that's alright. I just like seeing every pony have fun. Twilight jumped up a bit and grinned. Oh, that reminds me. She turned to Grevin and leaned in a bit, till her eyes were just a few inches from his, causing him to lean back. Grevin, I want to ask you about the different creatures from your homeland. I know about that dragon, but what are some of the other creatures? Maybe we can make costumes for them for this year's celebration. She smirked as she pulled back, knowing that this was not only a great chance to learn about Bastion, but to also possibly learn more about this mysterious man. Rarity smiled brightly. I think that's an absolutely wonderful idea, Twilight. I might even be able to help with some of these costumes if you like. It would be a great change of pace for one so fashion-savvy such as moi. Applejack rolled her eyes at her friend before turning to Grevin, who sat forward once more and rested his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped while his brow looked furrowed, deep in thought. Grevin, please? Could you tell us more about your homeland? He nodded quietly a moment before raising his head back up to look at the group.
Of course. I just wasn't quite sure where to begin. I'm not used to teaching anyone, any pony, about my homeland. I guess I could begin with one of the more legendary and dangerous creatures known to Bastion.
Rainbow leaned forward with a look of skepticism in her eyes, but her body language told him that she was just as curious as the rest. This better be good, buddy. It takes a lot to impress us.
Griffin smirked and nodded as he cleared his throat. Well, I guess I could begin with one of the more dangerous creatures, known as a vampire.
Pinkie Pie gasped and hid behind Fluttershy, who was already shivering at the dark tone his voice had begun to develop. Rainbow glanced over Fluttershy's shoulder and looked at the grinning mare. Pinkie, what are you doing? The pink mare poked her head out from behind her timid friend, a grin plastered onto her face. I'm practicing for when it gets really scary. The group laughed a bit before turning their gaze back to Grevin, who had shifted in his seat, leaning forward now, looking similar to a person telling a ghost story over an open campfire.
Vampires are very unique and dangerous creatures to face in Bastion. They can blend in with regular people or creatures with ease. They tend to only appear at night and mingle with crowds of people in taverns, finding prey to stalk, and eventually attack when the moment is right. But they have been seen out in daylight as well.
Applejack tilted her head to the side. She scratched the side of her head. Well, how is it they can blend in so easily? And why are you being so specific about day and night?
Well, the reason they can blend in so easily is because they can hide their features from people. You see, vampires feed off the blood or energy of everyday people. They have fangs that can retract into their mouths, and eyes that can change color from a blood red to a soft blue, for example, making it easier for them to sneak up on the prey in a crowd. Vampires tend to be very seductive, making it easy for them to pick a poor soul and pull them into a dark alley, where they strike, biting into their neck, draining them of their blood. As for day and night, well, some people think that daylight hurts vampires, and thus they can only come out at night. But this isn't true. They can come out in daylight, but they are in a very weakened state. It's much easier to kill a vampire in daylight than at night. He held out a small portion of his cloak. Many people believe that most vampires wear black cloaks similar to mine, and dress in provocative clothing, making it easy for them to spot. But that isn't always the case. They are smart, very intelligent, cunning, strong, and fast. They have powerful magic and can manipulate shadow and even levitate. They prefer to seduce their victims, luring them into a false sense of security. I've seen many a man in my old mercenary guild fall victim to vampires, be bitten, and then be exterminated. Rarity frowned, her blue eyes widening.
What do you mean by
Exterminated? He sighed. Well, you see, vampires aren't a race that looks like you or me. They are human. The condition is similar to a disease that infects them when bitten. If enough blood is drained and they drink the blood of the vampire who attacked them, they themselves will become one. It slowly takes them over, causing them to slowly fall into darkness, until the first bloodlust kicks in, and they go mad, trying to bite and feed on anyone they can get their hands on. He paused a moment as the group shifted slightly, swaying the train as it barreled down the tracks. Oddly enough, older vampires exist, and they have even been known to socially interact with people without any problems. It could be that with age comes the ability and wisdom to control themselves. Twilight blinked a moment as she took in everything he said. They were strong with magic, wore capes and provocative clothing, were wise, cunning, strong, fast, and seductive. A small smirk made its way onto her lips as she watched Screven out of the corner of her eye. Applejack noticed Twilight's smirk and frowned, realizing just what her friend had begun to think of. She quickly wrapped her hoof around Greven's arm and gave a small tug to get his attention.
What other kinds of creatures are there? Surely that vampire thingy isn't the only nighttime creature around, right?
He nodded as he steadied himself, sitting upright once more. This is true. There are many creatures in Bastion that favor the dark. Werewolves are another good example. They are similar to a vampire in their condition is spread through a bite, but they don't drink blood. Fluttershy blinked as she peeked out her head from under her pink mane, her curiosity peeking at hearing about this kind of wolf.
What do then, if I may ask?
He looked over at her and leaned forward a bit, making her lean in with anticipation. Well, they eat their prey. Man, beast, ponies. It doesn't matter to them. Fluttershy squeaked and pulled back, shivering slightly. He smiled reassuringly, hoping to calm the timid mare. I'm sorry. I did not mean to scare you. She didn't get a chance to reply as Dash zipped in between them, her eyes wide.
I gotta know what these things look like. They sound like something out of a daring do.
He shifted in his seat slightly as he pulled away from the cyan mare. Well, they have two forms, a regular form and then a transformed state. When they are in their regular form, they tend to have strong, fierce eyes and a muscular body. They emit a sense of wildness from themselves. They know what they want and will get it. They can be seductive, ugly, or plain as can be. They also have a strong sense of family. When they transform, well, that's where it gets interesting. They grow thick fur all over their bodies, and they also grow a long snout where their mouths are filled with razor-sharp teeth. Their arms and legs grow longer, and they gain very sharp claws. Their muscle mass also nearly triples, making them very strong, fast, and quite imposing. Most believe that these creatures cannot change unless there is a full moon. However, there are some that can change forms on will, making them very dangerous. Fluttershy shivered and ducked her head down.
Greven, aren't there any nice creatures you could tell us about?
He blinked for a moment before lightly bopping his forehead with the palm of his hand. Of course. I'm sorry. I have a tendency to only remember the dangerous beings in Bastion. There are most certainly creatures of great beauty, kindness, and joy. One that comes to mind actually reminds me a bit of you, Fluttershy. She blinked as her cheeks reddened slightly.
Reminds you of me?
He smiled and nodded as he rested his hands on his lap. Yes, these creatures are known as dryads, or wood nymphs in Bastion. They are magical creatures of great beauty, known for their kindness and joyful ways. They are spirits that inhabit some of the great forests in Bastion, connected through magic to the trees, making them one with nature. They tend to shy away from humans, but some have been known to help weary or lost travelers who may be injured, sick, or suffering from a total loss of hope. They move with incredible grace through the forest, their feet hardly ever touching the ground, and their voices are so soft that it makes one feel at ease the moment they speak. They can be dangerous if their trees are threatened, but for the most part, they are very kind. Fluttershy smiled as she fluttered her wings slightly, raising into the air a bit.
Oh, they sound wonderful.
They are. I was lucky to have met one when I was young. I wandered out of the city where I was living at the time in an attempt to find food in the nearby forest. There was a terrible storm that night, and the rain was coming down so hard that I was afraid I was going to be swept away in the flood. I had managed to take refuge under a large tree, where I cried myself to sleep. Rainbow Dash rolled her eyes.
A tough guy like you cried?
He sighed and shook his head. Rainbow, I was probably 5 at the time, not a well-trained, battle-hardened soldier. She grinned slightly as she sat down.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Anyway, the storm was getting worse, and I could hear thunder moving closer as the rain fell harder and harder. I was terrified and crying loudly for help, and that's when I felt a soft hand on my shoulder. At first I thought I was imagining things. Then I felt a pair of arms wrap around me and lift me up to a warm hug, holding me there so I could rest my head on a soft shoulder. I heard a soft voice speak into my ear, telling me that everything was all right. I would be fine, and when I opened my eyes to see an incredibly beautiful woman holding me. She had pale white skin, soft brown eyes, and earthy dark hair that had leaves weaved into it. She wore a simple green dress that seemed to sparkle in the rain, and wore no shoes. She smiled at me and held me until the storm passed. I remember that she had the scent of a fresh spring day, and she was so warm. It made me feel totally relaxed. I couldn't help but notice that she held me as she held me in a warm hug. The rain seemed to never touch her, or I, like it moved around us so it wouldn't get us wet. After the storm was over, she led me back to the edge of the forest, where I could find my way back to the city. It wasn't until I turned to thank her that I realized just what had occurred. She had disappeared into thin air, and I realized that a dryad had saved me that night. It was one of the best moments of my young life. A small sniff could be heard from several of the girls as they listened to his story. Rarity had small tears running down her face, while Fluttershy's eyes were beginning to well up as well. Pinkie Pie was comically crying, forcing Rainbow Dash to use an umbrella to avoid the spray of tears coming from her friend. Fluttershy smiled and looked down at her hooves, avoiding his eyes for the moment.
Graven, that's amazing. The kindness of these creatures is wonderful.
Aye, they are very special. Applejack cleared her throat, pulling his attention to her, causing a small frown to come across Fluttershy's lips.
Graven, can you tell us more about the creatures of your homeland? I think that we could all learn a lot more about them before this train ride is over.
Well, if you wish. I don't want to bore you. She grinned and putting a hoof on his shoulder.
Sugar Cube, don't you worry a lick about that.
The next morning, by the time the group had made their way to bed for the night, Grevin had managed to tell them about several creatures known in Bastion, including some of the more peaceful bunches, such as the dwarves in their stone cities in the mountains, as well as the dark elves who lived underground,
and even the sirens off the coast of the Crimson Islands. He had even mentioned some of the more dark-natured creatures, including more dragons, harpies, and kobolds. The girls all sat and listened with great interest as he spoke, taking in each word he spoke as if he were weaving some great, grand tale. There, of course, were a few odd moments as the evening went on, mostly from the antics of Pinkie Pie, but nothing awkward until the group had decided to get sleep and retire to the sleeping car. Grevin made his way into the cabin and took his usual bunk in the far corner of the car, allowing the front, more comfortable ones for the girls. But as he began to remove his swords and gauntlets, he began to bend over, only to bump into a soft form just behind him. He quickly turned to see Applejack looking over her shoulder, grinning as she began to settle herself into her bunk, just opposite of his. "Pardon me, Sugar Cube. I didn't realize I was standing so close there." He nodded quietly as he shifted his position, giving her a bit more room to move. "That's all right. I just wasn't paying close attention to where I was going." Just as he began to turn around, he felt something soft brush over his left arm, quickly followed by something sliding over his lower back, making him pause and glance back at the orange mare, who had turned back around to finish preparing her bunk, the only sign of movement being the small flick of the tip of her tail. He shook his head, deciding not to pursue the issue, and continued to turn around, only to meet a pair of soft cyan eyes looking at him from an uncomfortably close distance. He pulled back a bit to see that Fluttershy had pulled back a bit as well, clearly a bit startled by his reaction. Oh my, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to spook you, Grevin." He sighed a bit and gave a small smile. "It's all right, Fluttershy. I was just surprised, that's all. No harm done." She smiled and flew past him, tip of her wing lightly brushing over his shoulder, as she moved to the bunk above Applejack's. He turned once more and removed his armor, setting it down at the base of his bed, leaving him in a simple shirt, cloak, and trousers. He moved into his bunk and shifted his position so that he could look out the window, watching the setting sun in the distance. He didn't get much chance to gather his thoughts, though, when the sound of hooves approaching drew his attention back to the aisle, where he saw Twilight trot up, a small smile on her face. She grinned at the quiet man and lightly propped her forelegs on his bed, making him shift further into the small space. "You look comfy in there." He nodded a bit. "Aye, it's not as bad this time around, now that I'm not worried about meeting the princesses." She nodded in agreement and slowly climbed up onto the bunk above his, moving slowly, letting her tail flick towards him a bit as she pulled herself up. For a few moments there was silence, and he began to feel himself relax once more, until Twilight popped her head down from above, looking at him with wide eyes and her friendly upside-down grin. "I can't wait to learn more about the Spectral Knights. I've always enjoyed a good research project. Are you looking forward to it too?" He blinked a moment, taking a few seconds to respond, as he watched her mane bob slightly with each subtle movement of the train car. "Well, I must admit, I am curious to learn more about them. And, to be honest, there are several things I feel a need to learn more about." She tilted her head to the side, making her face take on a cute, confused look, while Applejack and Fluttershy turned in their own bunks to face the man, their own faces matching the question Twilight asked next. "What other things do you need to learn about?" He let his hands rest on his legs quietly, as he shifted in his bunk once more. "Well, to be honest, I want to go back to the castle where we first met. When I was hiding from you, I discovered a small crest on the wall that seemed quite similar to the crest on my arm. When I tried to touch it, there was a massive backlash that knocked me out for a time, and caused the accident that nearly..." He glanced at Fluttershy, a small frown coming to his lips, before averting his gaze and clearing his throat. "Anyhow, I plan on going back there alone next time, to avoid endangering anyone other than myself." A sudden sharp gasp drew his attention up at Fluttershy, who had moved her hooves to her mouth with wide, teary eyes. Applejack had a harsh look on her face. Her eyes narrowed, and Twilight had a very concerned look.
What? What did I say?
Applejack lunged forward, placing her front hooves on his bed, leaning forward, pushing Twilight to the side a bit, forcing him to push back against the window, effectively cornering him, a small frown forming on her lips. Oh, no, you don't. That place is dangerous, and I'll be pushing up daisies before I let you just wander in there and get hurt without any pony there to help you. His frown grew as his own stubborn nature began to take hold in his mind.
No, you will not be going there with me. I'm not going to let another incident occur. You know what happened in Canterlot. I can take a beating just fine. I'm not letting any of you put yourselves at risk. Not after what happened before.
Twilight shook her head. Grevin, we wouldn't be good friends that cared if we let you go off alone. I'm sorry, but I have to agree with Applejack. You shouldn't go alone. He narrowed his eyes as his right hand began to grip the cloth of his trousers.
I'm not a foolish man who can't handle himself in a bad situation. A few booby traps aren't enough to put me down. Besides, it isn't as though you would be able to keep me from going there. Don't forget, I can be sneaky as hell when I want to be.
Excuse me. The three mares were drawn up to the soft voice behind them, forcing them to turn to see Fluttershy, peeking out from behind her long mane, her blue eyes locking onto Grevin. I can't help but remember the last trap there knocked you out cold. So what if the next one is worse? What if you're knocked out and there's some sort of spell used that could really hurt you? You wouldn't be able to defend yourself. Also, I do think we would be able to keep you from sneaking off. If we really had to. Twilight crooked an eyebrow and looked at her friend. What do you mean, Fluttershy? She smiled a bit as she sat up, letting her mane move from hiding her face. Well, I could ask the birds and other woodland creatures to keep an eye out open for Grevin, and if they saw him, they could get in his way, or at least tell us where he went. He frowned, knowing that she was right. From what he knew, she could talk to animals in this world, and even the most highly trained stealth experts in Bastion couldn't get to a goal without being seen by some kind of bird or other creature. And while he knew he had some skill, he was by no means a master at the craft. He bit his tongue and growled a bit, looking away from the three mares, and his frustration showing.
Very well. I won't go back to the castle for now, but someday soon I plan on going back there. I need to see what that symbol is all about. I'll try to research the castle and the library in Ponyville first, but once that resource is exhausted, I'm going. Does that sound fair?
Applejack nodded, a small smirk coming to her lips. Sure, so long as we get to come along, Sugar Cube. He sighed and slowly crossed his arms.
I'll consider it.
The three mares each took a moment to look at one another, before returning to their bunks, seemingly satisfied with the answer he gave. Meanwhile, a few feet away, down the hall, Rarity, Pinkie Pie, and Rainbow Dash all sat in their bunks, looking down the aisle at their friends, each one of them smirking a bit. Rarity turned and winked at Pinkie Pie, a small giggle escaping her, while Rainbow Dash simply rolled her eyes. The group finally settled for the night, extinguishing all the candles in the car, leaving them enveloped in darkness. The only sound that filled the train was the click-clack of the rails and the soft breathing escaping the sleeping ponies. Grevin, however, didn't fall asleep right away. He sat with his back against the wall for most of the night, his eyes looking out the window, watching the moonlit countryside as he resumed his thoughts from before. Scene change. Ponyville. A few days later. Grevin stepped out of the hot barn and wiped his forehead with a simple cloth before stuffing it back in his pocket and bending down to pick up his now empty basket rigs. It had been a few days since they had returned to Ponyville from their adventures in Canterlot, and for a time things had returned to normal, with the exception of life on the farm. One morning he had woken up to learn that he was being moved from the fields to the orchards in order to help with something called applebuck season, which he learned was the time of year in which the entire apple clan would go about harvesting the massive crops of apples they attended to so carefully. As such, he, Big Macintosh, and Applejack had spent the last several days bucking and carrying apples into the barn, which was nearly bursting at the seams now. Grevin took a small breath and smiled slightly as he turned to look out at the massive fields of trees that now appeared to be completely empty. He had to admit he enjoyed this work. It was simple, productive, and it didn't involve weapons. His attention was drawn to the large work pony and his friend, Big Macintosh, who was bringing in another load of apples from the orchard.
Is that the last load, Big Mac?
The red stallion shook his head.
Nope.
He glanced over his shoulder and seemed to slump a bit before looking back at the man before.
AJ has a few more trees to clear. She said she could use your help, and that the two of you should be able to handle it no problem.
This made Grevin pause for a moment before nodding and beginning his trek past the farmer.
So, I take it you're going to pack it in for the night, then?
Big Mac nodded as he moved past his friend.
Yup.
He paused mid-step, though, and shifted slightly to look at his unique friend for a moment, looking as though he wanted to say something. But instead, he turned and resumed his path back to the barn. Grevin kept his eyes on the ground as his mind thought about the orange mare he was on his way to meet. Ever since their trip to Canterlot, she had begun to behave a little differently around him. At first it was little things, catching her looking at him from across the dinner table where, when he caught her, she would quickly avert her gaze. Then, more recently, she asked him to come help her in the orchard, leaving Big Mac to tend the fields alone. For a time, work had progressed normally, with simple conversations between the two friends. But, from time to time, he would be bent over to pick up fallen leaves or branches, and feel something soft brush up against his side. Whenever he would turn to look, he would sometimes see Applejack's tail, flicking innocently behind her, as she faced away from him, but other times, he would turn and bump into her, finding that she had been trying to help him with his current task. Normally, she would just sheepishly smile, apologize, and turn away, letting the matter rest. However, Grevin found it a little troubling. He couldn't help but think back to what had happened with the princess in the castle, her actions still playing out through his mind, her words echoing in his thoughts. But it didn't last long. A sharp whistle made him look up to where he could see the smiling face of Applejack, waving him over in the distance. Behind her were a few remaining trees that needed to be harvested. He waved and quickly made his way over and set his baskets down around the bases of the trees, stepping back to let the mare do her work.
Sorry it took me so long to get back here. I guess I'm beginning to tire out.
Applejack smirked and shook her head, her blonde mane shifting with the movement, small drops of sweat flying off as she moved over to the first tree and gave it a mighty buck, knocking its bounty down into the baskets below. I can't help but have a hard time believing that, Sugar Cube. I think you could even outrun Rainbow Dash in a marathon and not even get tired. Grevin shook his head as he moved to the side, allowing her room to do her work.
I doubt that. She is the fastest Pegasus I've ever seen in Equestria.
Applejack laughed and bucked the next tree, more apples falling into the well-placed baskets, just a few missing their intended target and rolling out from the base of the tree. She leaned down to begin picking up one of the stray apples when a loud creak from atop the tree caught her attention. Looking up, Applejack and Grevin saw a large, dead branch begin to sway and groan before snapping and falling through the foliage towards the orange mare. Grevin quickly lunged forward, tackling her and pulling them both into a small somersault, narrowly avoiding the heavy branch crashing down where they once were. Applejack sighed as she felt herself come to a stop, resting on something soft and warm, and quite comfortable. She took a slow breath, enjoying the earthy scent that wafted to her nose. Slowly, she opened her eyes and couldn't help but smile as she noticed that she had landed on top of Grevin and was resting comfortably on his chest, while her hooves rested on his shoulders. She slowly sat up, letting her haunches lay rested against his waist, and looked down at the man under her, a small hint of red coming to her cheeks. Thanks, Grevin. You sure kept my hand out of the fire there. That could have been pretty bad. She smiled brightly down at him, noting the small hint of red coming to his cheeks as well, even as he shook his head. Grevin looked up at the orange mare, as he noticed the way the sunlight drew his attention to her blonde mane, her soft smile, the small freckles on her face, as well as her bright green eyes. He looked to the side and cleared his throat, trying to push the image up from his mind, a sheepish smile coming to his lips.
You're welcome, AJ. I didn't think Big Mac or Applebloom would really want me to bring you back to the farm injured, but I doubt that branch would have really hurt you at all if I hadn't moved you.
She couldn't help but find it cute how he smiled and looked away, while trying to play down his actions. She had noticed that he never really bragged about what he did. He never boasted about his strength or his bravery. She liked that about him. Slowly, she began to lean down, letting her chest rest against his, moving her face closer. Grevin. The tone in her voice made him turn his head to look back up at her. The sight that greeted him made his breath hitch in his throat. Applejack had a sultry smile on her lips. Her eyes were half-lidded, and her Stetson was pushed back, shielding them both from the sunlight.
Yes?
She pushed a hoof over his shoulder and took a quiet breath. I know I already thanked you back when we first met, but I wanted to say it again. Thank you for saving Applebloom and her friends from that fire. If you hadn't, well, there's no doubt in my mind they would have been killed. He shook his head as he began to rise to his elbows, trying to move out from under the farm pony.
I didn't do anything special, AJ. I just did what any decent being would do.
She frowned and pushed him back down, holding him there with her hooves on his chest. No, it was pretty darn special, and I want to thank you. If you hadn't been there for them, for Fluttershy, for the ponies in the marketplace in Canterlot, and for me, just moments ago. She leaned down further, her voice becoming softer, her eyes beginning to close as the gap between them narrowed. Well, I think we're all very lucky that you came to Equestria. He reached back and lightly scratched the back of his head, and began to turn his head to the side.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you think so. But, AJ, don't we have work that needs to be done?
She blinked, pulling back from him, coming to her senses. What was she doing? She was ready to kiss him. She didn't even know how he felt. Her ears lowered as she sheepishly looked away, and quickly got off him, stepping to the side, letting him sit up. Sorry about that. It's fine, really. He began brushing the dirt from his shirt and pants, not seeing how Applejack was watching. In her mind, there was a small battle being waged. Should she tell him how she is beginning to feel, or even ask how he would feel about having a mare friend, or should she wait and give him more time? If she gave him more time, then he could eventually allow himself to love, or he could easily slide back into his shell. If she told him how she felt, he could accept her feelings and perhaps even return them, or he could reject her and possibly be driven away by how she feels. Applejack grit her teeth and narrowed her eyes. She knew what she had to do. She had to be honest with him. It was her element after all. She cleared her throat a bit and looked up at him, while he rose to his feet. Grevin. He looked over at her as he finished dusting off his pants. Yes? She fidgeted a bit as her front hoof began to dig into the ground a bit, Her eyes lowered as her nerves began to get to her. Well, I've been wanting to ask you a question. He took a small step back and let himself rest against the nearby apple tree. What is it? She sighed and kept her eyes averted. I was wondering. She froze. She knew she had to talk to him. It was easy. He was still Grevin, the nice, kind, gentle, understanding man he had always been. I was wondering. He tilted his head to the side, a small frown coming to his lips. Yes? She blinked. It was now or never. She had to tell him her feelings. I was wondering if you know what you're gonna dress up as for Nightmare Night after the party. Next time. She would tell him next time. He blinked a few moments as confusion washed over his face. He reached down and began to attach the now filled baskets of apples to his carrying bag. Well, to be honest, I don't know if I'll even go. She frowned and stepped closer to him as he hefted the baskets up off the ground and began to walk. She slowly let herself get a little too close from time to time, letting him brush against her side as they moved. What? Why not? It'll be a lot of fun. He looked forward toward the farm, a frown on his lips. I wouldn't want to scare any of the young folks. And on top of that, what could I dress up as? She smirked and laughed a bit, shaking her head, her blonde mane shifting somewhat over her back. Scare the foals. Sugared you. After what happened in Canterlot, Pinkie Pie went around and told your tale to every pony she could. You're pretty much a celebrity in Ponyville now. A regular hero. Hey, wait a minute. That's perfect. He blinked, looking over at her, a small sense of worry growing deep in the back of his mind, when he saw the excited smile on her face. What's perfect? She grinned and lightly hip-checked him. You could come as a hero. You have very shiny armor, and why not lose your cloak and hood and come like that? I think it would be perfect for the party. He took a few moments to think it over, before looking back over at the orange mare. You think so? She smiled and nodded. Sure as shoot I do. Well, perhaps. Applejack grinned as another idea popped into her mind. She already got wind of what Twilight's costume was going to be, so she figured that tonight she would go and see her and see about making it a theme. This could be a very interesting nightmare night indeed.